Hello, boys and girls. This is Mrs. Hargrove. I'm here to read with you the chapter 2 of the European exploration of North America. We'll start with a little bit of vocabulary and then move on to the actual read aloud. You'll be hearing the word conquering, to take control of by force. Conquistadors, same root word, conquering, conquistadors. Spanish words for conquerors. They were travelers, soldiers, and explorers from Spain who traveled to North, Central, and South America to look for wealth, conquer the native people, and gain control of the land. Immune, protected from disease. Quantities, amounts or numbers of something. Raided, attacked in a sudden and unexpected way, often to steal goods. Recruiting, persuading someone to become a new member of a group or organization. And a trek, a difficult trip or journey. So, what have we already learned? Here is some of the routes of Christopher Columbus. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, all different colors. The first voyage is the one that we know the most of. And you can see how he came down to the Canary Islands and landed in Hispaniola, right? And then back to the Canary Islands and back up. But each one of these little, it's called a spaghetti plot kind of thing because it sort of looks like spaghetti. You just have to follow the different color in order to know where he actually traveled on each of his journeys. So what area was Columbus hoping to reach? He was aiming for the East Indies, right? Why was Columbus eager to find a shorter route to the East Indies? He wanted to gain wealth and fame. Why did King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella agree to sponsor his voyage? They wanted to claim wealth and new lands in honor of Spain. On what lands did he end up landing? Did he make it to the East Indies? No, he made it to the West Indies. What year did Columbus sail to islands in the Caribbean? You know that one, 1492. And upon which island did Columbus land? Claim for Spain and build a fort. Hispaniola. That's right, excuse me. What do we know? We have to think back to some other stories that we have heard in third grade, but think all the way back to second grade to find out what you remember about slaves and slavery. You remember that throughout history, many different groups of people in different areas of the world have had slaves. Slaves were considered the property of their owners. Slaves had to obey their owners and do difficult work with no pay. Slaves were often treated poorly and did not have many freedoms. Slaves during the time of the ancient Romans and the Vikings were often the people on the losing side of a war when Rome was expanding into new territories, or were people captured by the Vikings on one of their raids. What do you remember about slavery in the United States? Well, from the time of the birth of our nation to around the time of the U.S. Civil War, really just about 100 years after Columbus's voyage, millions of Africans had been captured in Africa, sold to slave traders, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to be sold in markets like property. These slaves worked on large areas of farmland called plantations. So in today's read aloud and in future read alouds, you're going to hear how Native Americans, often captured by Europeans, were treated poorly and taken as slaves. However, slavery was also practiced among Native American tribes. Just like the Romans and the Vikings, Native Americans would take slaves of the people who were on the losing side of a war between their two tribes. So Native Americans enslaved each other. So why are we reading today? Well, we're going to continue to learn about Christopher Columbus. We're at the end of the last read aloud. You heard that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain agreed to fund another voyage as his sponsors. Predict, what do you think Columbus will find on his second voyage? We're going to learn about his other voyages and what his accomplishments would mean for other European explorers who would come after him. So here's the map of Columbus's 4 voyages. Christopher Columbus made 4 voyages to the West Indies, convinced that he had reached the East Indies in Asia. The voyage most people know about is the first one, the voyage when Columbus landed in the West Indies. In some ways, Columbus's second voyage was even more important. If you want to understand what happened in the Americas with European exploration over the following 100 years or so after Columbus, it helps to know something about his second voyage. When Columbus returned to Europe after his first transatlantic voyage, he was greeted as a hero. Word of his expedition spread rapidly in Spain and throughout Europe. The report he sent to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain was printed in large quantities or amounts, using the recent invention of the printing press. Thousands of Europeans read Columbus's report, and others heard the reports read aloud. Soon, everybody was talking about Columbus and his discoveries. Some people were not sure if he had really sailed to Asia as he claimed, but they were sure he had found something new and exciting. Columbus was honored by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He was named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and as he had hoped, he was given ships and money for a second voyage. The second voyage was a much, much bigger operation than the first voyage. Columbus had a fleet of 3 ships and about 100 men for his first voyage. On the second voyage, he had a fleet of 17 ships and more than 1,000 men. When he was recruiting sailors for his first voyage, Columbus had a hard time finding sailors who were willing to sail west into uncharted waters. When he was recruiting men for his second voyage, he had so many eager, interested sailors that he had to turn many of them away. The ships of the second voyage left Spain in September of 1493. After a stop in the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, Columbus and his men sailed west. They sighted land in early November. Columbus explored the coasts of several islands, but he was eager to get back to the fort he and the 39 of his crew members had built on Hispaniola on his first voyage. He hoped that, in his absence, the men he had left behind would have developed peaceful trading relationships with the Taino, and that they would have collected a lot of gold. What Columbus actually found was quite different. The fort had been burned to the ground. The Spaniards he had left on the island had been killed, and there was no great hoard of collected gold. Instead of trading peacefully with the Taino of Hispaniola, the Spaniards had treated them cruelly. The Europeans had raided their village and taken many people as slaves. They had taken gold wherever they could find it. After a while, the Taino fought back, attacked the fort, and killed the Spaniards. Columbus decided to build another fort on Hispaniola and name it Isabella after the Queen of Spain. He left his brother Diego in charge of it and urged him to find the gold that Columbus felt sure was on the island. Diego and his men found some gold, but not as much as Columbus had led the king and queen to think was on the island. By 1495, Columbus's men had become unhappy, and Columbus grew anxious. It became clear to his men that there was much less gold than Columbus had exaggerated in his report. They felt that Columbus had lied to them. Some of them had already sailed back to Spain to complain about Columbus's exaggeration and leadership. Meanwhile, Columbus continued to look for gold, using cruel methods to get as much gold as he could. He made laws that enslaved and punished the natives if they didn't collect enough gold for the Spaniards. What made the laws even more cruel was the fact that Hispaniola had only a little gold. There was no way the enslaved native people could supply the amount of gold Columbus demanded. As if this weren't bad enough, many of the Taino became infected with diseases to which many of the Spanish had become immune. The Taino on Hispaniola had never been exposed to the types of germs the Spanish carried in their bodies. Through interaction with the Spaniards, the natives came in contact with germs that their bodies could not fight. Over the next several years, many of the Taino became sick, and hundreds of thousands of them died of the diseases, the most common of which was smallpox. Before Columbus's voyage, the Taino had a population of around 2 million. Between disease and Spanish conquest during the years following the arrival of Columbus and his men, the Taino only numbered a few thousand. In 1496, it was clear that there was no more gold to be found on Hispaniola. Columbus decided to make a new law that said that the native people had to help develop large farms called plantations and work as slaves for the Spanish. In just a few years, the Spanish were firmly in control of the island of Hispaniola. After that point, they began to spread out, exploring and conquering other nearby islands in the Caribbean. The many men who led these voyages of exploration and conquest were known as conquistadors, the Spanish word for conquerors. These conquistadors were travelers, soldiers, and explorers from Spain who traveled to North, Central, and South America to look for wealth, conquer the native peoples, and gain control of land. They came to the Americas to find the same things Columbus had been looking for in unexplored parts of America: gold, spices, land, slaves, fame, and power. By the year 1542, 15 years, not 15, 50 years after the first voyage of Christopher Columbus, many Spanish conquistadors had explored and conquered most of South America, all of Central America, and a significant part of North America. Christopher Columbus died believing he had reached the islands of the East Indies in Asia, known at the time just as the Indies. When the Spanish realized this mistake, it was decided to name the area where Columbus had landed the West Indies, and the Spice Islands in Asia that he had tried to reach the East Indies. What happened in those 50 years after Columbus's first voyage? First, a conquistador named Juan Ponce de Leon conquered the island of Puerto Rico to the east of the island of Hispaniola. At about the same time, another conquistador by the name of Diego Velazquez subdued the native people on the island of Cuba, an island to the west of Hispaniola. Soon the Spanish began to extend their control beyond the islands of the Caribbean Sea. They began to explore and conquer the mainland of North and South America. In 1513, Ponce de Leon explored the coast of Florida and claimed it for Spain. In the very same year, Vasco Nunez de Balboa fought his way through the jungles of Panama and became the first Spaniard to reach the Pacific Ocean. A few years later, in 1519, Hernán Cortés led a Spanish army into Mexico. He ordered that the fleet of ships be burned when he and his crew landed, so that everyone would understand there was no turning back. He marched his army inland and eventually conquered the mighty Aztec Empire and its king, Moctezuma II. The conquistador Francisco Pizarro led his men deep into South America, and by 1532 had conquered the other great empire of the Americas, the Inca Empire in Peru. The defeat of this great empire was due in large part to disease. Because the natives had no immunity to the diseases the Europeans brought with them, many natives became sick and or died of these diseases after coming in contact with the Europeans. After helping Pizarro conquer the Inca Empire, the conquistador Hernando de Soto turned his attention to North America. He landed his troops on the west coast of Florida and led them on a long trek through what is now the southeastern part of the United States. And by the way, he went through North Carolina. At about the same time, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado led an army of Spaniards north from Mexico into what is now the southwestern United States, hoping to find the cities of gold he had heard about. In the following read-alouds, you will learn about the journeys of these conquistadors and other explorers and hear about their bold ideas, their voyages, their struggles in search of gold, and their interactions with the Native Americans. Here are a few questions to think about. Were your predictions correct about what Columbus found on his second voyage? And how did the Spanish public respond to Columbus on his return to Spain? And how was Columbus's report able to spread so quickly and easily? What had just been invented so that people could print things off? First time it had ever happened. Who sponsored Columbus's second voyage? You had heard that Columbus explored the coasts of different islands before returning to Hispaniola. What did he find when he got to Hispaniola? Describe the way that Columbus and his crew members treated the Taino. And how did the Taino respond to this treatment? Why did Columbus's crew grow increasingly unhappy? And what did some of the crew do? Compare and contrast Columbus's first voyage and his second voyage. Remember, compare is what are the similarities, and contrast is what are the differences. And who were the conquistadors? How do you think the Native Americans felt about the conquistadors? All right, that's it for today. I will read with you again in a few days.